The after era, after the war, death and destruction, and before the before era, before the Great Depression, is referred to as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age. The after era proved to be a time of profound transformation and cultural flourishing. Freed from the shackles of war, people sought new expressions and freedom of expression. This period leading up to the Great Depression proved to be momentous and important not only for culture, but also for industrial development, including the development of the automobile industry. Automobiles. The 1920s, especially the period from 1923 to 1929, was a time of impressive growth for the American economy. While the GDP growth numbers themselves were not record-breaking, averaging about 4.5% per year, the economy underwent fundamental structural changes. The 1920s is often referred to as the first automobile decade in American history. The famous Model T, produced on the assembly lines of the J. Ford Company, was sold starting in 1920 at a record low price, comparable to the average salary of an ordinary American for 2 months. Other automakers tried to keep up, not only offering competitive models, but also developing a variety of consumer credit schemes that made the new means of transportation even more affordable. The spread of cars required the accelerated construction of highways, roads, in turn, stimulated the development of related infrastructure, from motels to new shopping centers. It is clear that the first cars existed in the pre-war years, but, of course, it was a luxury item, which could not afford not everyone, even a rich man. And besides, usually in each car was a driver. The owner of the car will not turn the steering wheel. It is somehow strange. And then everything begins to change. First of all, there are more and more cars. It becomes fashionable. Speed. Today these speeds would seem ridiculous to us, but at that moment it was mesmerizing. You can drive somewhere on a country road. There are no traffic jams yet, of course. From the moment when Henry Ford started to produce his cars on the conveyor belt, cars became cheaper. Cars became easier to produce. There were much more of them. Life began to change. One American humorist wrote the following: Mr. Ford, it will take 100 years to understand whether you have helped us or hurt us. But it is already clear today that you have changed us completely. In America, where, of course, automobiles would spread fastest before World War I. One family in 13 had an automobile in 1920. One family in 3, that is, 1 in 3 families died in the late 1920s for families in 5. Well, that is, the majority of the population. And in the mid-1920s, 1 in 8 workers worked in the automobile industry. Model T, which was produced by Ford plants for many years, very quickly, quite cheaply. A model that could be any color, as long as that color was black, which also simplified things, because you didn't have to think about the design. All the time the same black design. And here already Fords flooded America, and then the whole world. In parallel with this, the company General Motors is developing, which follows a different path. On the contrary, if Ford puts on traditionality on one and the same model, it is assumed that a person, having bought a Ford car, will drive it, well, maybe not all his life, but for a very long time. The cars produced by General Motors are more expensive than Ford and more diverse. And this has completely changed the market. First of all, after the war, consumer credit began to develop, so people could take out a loan and buy a car, and then a few years later buy a car again. There was a lot of effort to do that. This year this color is fashionable, and in the future another, and this model, and then another. General Motors introduced the concept of a model going out of fashion, and it was a conscious exit, an organized exit. Not just people got bored, but the company itself started advertising another model, presenting it as more fashionable, respectively, pushing people to sell their outdated car and buy a new one. The first cars had hand brakes, which were quite difficult to switch. General Motors cars have foot brakes, which were easier. And cars are becoming available to a large number of women, students, maybe even high school students, so it's a whole new picture of the world. One more important thing. You can remember any old photos or movies where the action takes place in the early 20th century. The car will be open. Accordingly, you drive it in good weather, otherwise it will be very bad. After the war, cars become closed. They have a roof, they have windows. You can drive in any weather, in the rain, in the snow, in the wind, whatever you like. That is, the car becomes ubiquitous, accessible, well, maybe not to everyone, but to a very large number of people, and allows you to make a variety of trips that you can go for a walk. You can make a long journey of entertainment, and tourism will develop. There are professions that are interested in driving a car, for example, a rural doctor. In general, for people living in the countryside, it is very useful. You can get in and quickly move to a neighboring village or to the city. The speed of movement changes as if the distance is shortened. The automobile industry created a huge number of jobs, but Ford's factories paid more than other places for very hard work, but paid more. And he began to take people who were willing to do hard work. Ford himself was an unpleasant man. He was a racist. He was an anti-Semite. He was a fascist sympathizer. That didn't stop him from taking immigrants. He took black people. He took disabled people if they could do the job. So those who maybe others wouldn't take, he took them because they were willing to do the hard work. But they were paid well. And when the wages in the automobile industry grew, others gradually pulled up. The level of wages increased. I can't say, of course, that it was only because of the cars. But at any rate, it increased, and the purchasing power increased, and people started buying more. A whole infrastructure grew up around cars, gas stations. Gas stations where people also work and where fuel is delivered. That's a lot of jobs too. Roads are completely changing, and people traveling on these roads. Even robbing banks became more common with the use of cars. It is clear why. It is very convenient. Jump out, jump in, drive away. As we have seen in many movies, that is, the automobile has changed many different areas of life. Life has become faster, more comfortable, in some ways more costly, but also more energetic. Let's say, electricity. The second powerful driver of the American economy in the 1920s was the increase in the production of electricity. This is an important sign of the 1920s. In one of the post-war years in New York City, at the mansion of the Vanderbilts, the richest people in America, there was a reception where Mrs. Vanderbilt, who greeted the guests in a dress that was all covered with little electric lights. She was like a walking chandelier, and she was all sparkling. Well, it's clear that the rich have their quirks, but it's very characteristic that she senses the new. What's in the air? There's electricity everywhere, electric lighting. Again, it's not just about what's brighter than candles. Life is changing. For example, life by candlelight has always been organized in rich houses, in poor villages, in cities, so that the most important things happen in the light of day. In the evening, of course, you can light a candle or, I don't know, a lucina in the village and read. It's very intense. Naturally, the rich can afford a lot of candles. It's even better if, as in Versailles, they are reflected in the mirror gallery. That's actually a bit expensive. Plus, candles burn oxygen. It is not by chance that ladies fainted at balls. There was simply nothing to breathe. The streets are dark. Of course, in the most developed cities during the 6th century already have gas lamps. Not so that everything shines. And then there's electricity. You can walk in the evening without fear that you will fall into a ditch or that you will be robbed. Everything sparkles, everything shines. At home, it's light in the evening. And the daily routine is completely changed. You don't have to solve everything quickly before it gets dark. You can, for example, spend the whole evening reading. In many educated and even not so educated families, it's becoming a normal evening activity to sit and read aloud together, or each person reads his own book. The level of reading, by the way, has increased, simply because there is more time for reading in the evening, before going to bed. And here is a life that is becoming more and more comfortable, more and more easy. Household electrical appliances and advertising. The 1920s was the beginning of the widespread use of household appliances, hair dryers, irons, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines. By the end of the decade, 45% of American homes had radios, which did more than just foster a new system of consumption. The more external life changes, the more needs people have. The more they want something else to change and something else to change. It became easier to clean the apartment with a vacuum cleaner. And it would be good if something new was invented in the kitchen, some other device, some other simplification of life. Of course, advertising existed before the war and in the 6th century, but the bigger the market, the more needs, the more advertising. And now, by the way, again, all these new devices make it possible to advertise in a new way. For example, advertising appears in radio programs, and the radio listens to more and more people. Well, I'm not talking about advertising on the streets, advertising in newspapers. All the time people are offered new things, and it's not just. Last year there were such dresses, and this year, such, and they are really all new things. All new devices, all new improvements. Of course, advertising already at that moment works well, approximately the same as today, maybe only with other technical means. To create anxiety, you're dressed wrong, you don't use this toothpaste, you don't use this medicine. God, what will happen to you? In the 1920s they advertised mouthwash, the same Listerine that exists today. And they advertised it as follows, they say it behind your back. I remember that about 20 years ago, there was such an advertisement for deodorant only, that no one will tell you that you smell like sweat, but everyone will be watching. Turns out that was already there. They're talking behind your back. He never understood why. Well, I mean, apparently. His lover turned him down. He proposed to a girl. She turned him down. Why? Because he had bad breath, and he didn't realize. Stupid, because he didn't buy mouthwash. She was often a bridesmaid, but she never became a bride. Well, she didn't rinse her mouth out. Who'd marry someone like that? Of course, something like that existed already in the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th. But it did not reach such proportions as in the 1920s. Advertising becomes compulsive. Advertising shapes taste. And advertising shapes demand and directs people more and more towards consumption. And, of course, there is still that post-war flavor. We suffered so much, we denied ourselves so many things, but why can't we afford it now? Why can't we please ourselves? Why not get that delightful feeling of owning a new dish, a new car, a new appliance, something new? New. As one advertising man said at the time, and I think a lot of advertising men have said it since, we don't sell people tea. We sell a magical feeling that only brews in our teapot. Books by subscription. The rise in popularity of radio. In 1926, the Books of the Month Club was invented. People subscribed and paid a small subscription fee. A special jury chose the book of the month, and sometimes they chose very good books. Sometimes some completely passable ones, but they chose. And then people received that particular book by subscription. They could, of course, choose it themselves, but smart people somewhere in New York sit there. They decide it and send it to us, and if the book became the book of the month, then, accordingly, the whole America read it. At the same time in the 1920s, an ingenious move was also invented. Reader's Digest, which is still very popular today, started to come out of the building. Short articles summarizing the content of books, some extracts, some reasoning. That is, this is the consumption of culture, which can now be often consumed in the evening, too. Well, such a short, condensed, which is convenient to sell, and people consume it with pleasure. Just as the radio starts to bring home entertainment besides advertising. Still, before, to learn something, you had to, say, go to listen to a lecture. And to listen to music, you had to go to a concert, and to read a book, you had to buy it or borrow it from the library. This all remains. But at the same time the radio starts to use the most diverse topics, they start to transmit music. Sometimes absolutely wonderful. By the way, they start to transmit plays. They start to transmit some programs for housewives. So here is a woman who is alone at home. Her husband is away. Her children are at school, say. Or she doesn't have children yet, She is doing some household chores or dressing up, and then she is told, day after day, a story about love, about intrigue, about villains. How pleasant! For those who need culture, they can read books, they can talk about books, children's programs. That is, the radio begins to serve huge needs from entertainment to improve their cultural level, to buy some things, or just their home advice. And it all comes straight to the home. How convenient it all is. It's very interesting. We're talking about the jazz age. That jazz was not broadcast on the radio at first. But fashion is fashion, and in 1924 a new work written by Gershwin, Rhapsody in the Blues Style, was broadcast on the radio. It turned out to be a decent thing. It was broadcast on the radio. It was no big deal. It's not like it's in nightclubs somewhere. And they started listening to that kind of music too. And country music started to be heard on the radio. You'd think a man should be playing banjo on a wagon. But no, you can sit at home in the city and listen to him playing somewhere driving a cart. The development and spread of jazz music. Why did jazz become so popular? And yet the 1920s is when jazz becomes incredibly fashionable. Before World War I, jazz already existed. There were some musical compositions that were performed by black musicians somewhere in bars, in clubs in New Orleans, and outside of New Orleans. In general, no one had heard of jazz. Somewhere there are some black people far away in the South playing something strange, so wild. Not like normal classical music, and not like pop music either. Playing without notes, improvising. In general, it's incomprehensible. But in fact, not many people talked about it. Precisely because initially jazz was not recorded in any way. There were not yet so developed and widespread means of recording to record what was played there. So, accordingly, no one knew about it. By the end of World War I, jazz had moved north, and it became known in the big cities of the north. In New York, in Chicago. I wonder why that happened. Well, first of all, there's a war going on. The war industry is developing. There is a great need for labor in the factories in the north, and a lot of people from the south, among whom, of course, there were a lot of black people, moved to the north in search of work. And, obviously, with these migrants, they also transferred their love for this strange incomprehensible music, which was suddenly noticed. They might not have noticed, so it's not just that people have moved. It was, of course, that jazz was meeting some new needs. The beginning of the 20th century, when, of course, the whole European culture, or North American culture, in any case, the culture based on some European principles, is going through a crisis. It seems that the art, music, theater, those previous ones, going gradually from the Renaissance through this V century, the 6th century, have exhausted themselves. It's enough, we can't go on like this. This crisis had been brewing since the end of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th, the war intensified the general disillusionment with the previous life and, in particular, with the previous culture. This began, of course, before the war, the search for new cultures, new consonances, new combinations of colors, new forms. It could be Chinese art, Japanese art, African art, primitive art, art that doesn't resemble the conventional, the familiar, an attempt to find something completely new. And in this situation, music played not by classical pianists or violinists who come out in concert halls, or even by some singers in music halls, but by these strange black people with strange consonances, strange rhythms, and such energetic rhythms that seem to come from the depths of the subconscious. From the hot southern states. This is all incredibly attractive. Jazz will be seen as a whole new word, both literally and figuratively. And jazz, which became fashionable in America, very quickly records appeared. It is listened to not only in America, it gets to Europe, it becomes incredibly fashionable. Already European musicians begin to imitate in one way or another successfully American jazz. And soon all over Europe dance to jazz. 1920s, of course, the era of jazz. On the other hand, it is a big question whether Fitzgerald had music in mind when he wrote about the jazz age. Jazz age. What did the word jazz mean in the 1920s? In his essay, the title of which translates Echoes of the Jazz Age or Shards of the Jazz Age, he doesn't really talk about music, but about other things. And the word jazz originally meant hustle and bustle, confusion. Confusion. It was later that it acquired other shades of music. If it's confusion, it's bad confusion. There's something wrong with it. Then there will be Bob Fosse's great movie All That Jazz, where there is no jazz either, but a strange, confusing, rather dirty and complicated life, which for some reason is called that way. This word has acquired some kind of sexual meaning. This word has acquired the meaning of deceitfulness, although maybe Fitzgerald has already given it this connotation. Jazz is not only music, it is a strange, confused, not very sincere, tense, difficult era, which is associated, above all, with the 1920s. In his Echoes of the Jazz Age, Fitzgerald wrote, "It was the age of miracles. It was the age of art. It was the age of extremes and the age of satire. The whole country was gripped by a thirst for pleasure and the pursuit of pleasure." The word jazz, which now no one considers obscene, meant first sex, then a style of dance and, finally, music. When people talk about jazz, they mean a state of nervous excitement about the state that prevails in large cities as the front line approaches them, when there is nothing left to lose. The First World War turned the world upside down. We've already talked about the political changes that took place in the world after the First World War. A lot of things really changed. Empires crumbled, empires collapsed. In their place there were many new states, new ideas about power, new political ideas, the rise of communists, the revival of fascism. Many things happened. But in addition to purely political changes, in addition to the emergence of new states, there were absolutely new phenomena in people's lives, in culture, in everyday life, in ideas about the world. And these phenomena determined a lot of things in the way life developed in the 1920s. Any war destroys the old life, the old world, the old ideas. Such a huge, grandiose, terrible, bloody war as the one that lasted from 1914 to 1918. It destroyed everything, the previous established ideas about power. It is no coincidence that the world is left so much. Somewhere there is a revolution, somewhere there is an uprising. Somewhere people just vote differently because this former power, this former establishment that dragged people into the war, it falls away. It causes disgust. And this applies not only to state power. Authorities have become much less obeyed. The authority of the family, the authority of tradition, the authority of parental authority, the authority of public opinion. And this is understandable. The people who went through the war, and these were mostly young men who were first of all drafted into the war. In the previous decade, it was assumed that they were following in their fathers' footsteps, that they were living like their fathers, that young aristocrats in England were going to the same colleges in Oxford or Cambridge where their fathers had studied, that girls were finding husbands, maybe on the advice of their parents, that they were going to do things that were accepted in society, that were recognized, and so on. And then the war came, and then everything changed. And it was simply impossible to go back to a quiet life, to some conversations in the drawing rooms, to the search for a groom, to traditional entertainment. It had all gone somewhere. Of course, sitting in the trenches, the British, French, Germans, Russians dreamed that they would return home, and this old, former life would return. But it was no more. It was gone. It disappeared with the first shots in 1914. In 1918, to listen to parents, to listen to the opinion of neighbors, to live with an eye on the opinion of secular society, or just society, it was impossible. Those people who had seen such things in the trenches, in France or in Flanders, now all these former institutions were meaningless and empty to them. Ernest Hemingway gave the world Gertrude Stein's statement, "You are all a lost generation," as an epigraph to his novel Fiesta, or And the Sun Rises. And ever since then, a great many young people of that time have been referred to as the lost generation. Indeed, this is what is reflected in the novels of Hemingway, in the novels of Remarque and many other writers. These young people who came from the war, who had seen God knows what, who were disappointed in life. But today we would say they are experiencing post-traumatic syndrome. They are trying to fit into this world. They are not succeeding. because those who live quietly here. They cannot understand those who lived through the horrors of some shelling in Flanders. Comrades who came from the front, if they came, and painful memories. Some attempts to get into this world. On the other hand, the hierarchy collapses, because at the front, where, of course, there had to be obedience to the commander, the whole military hierarchy, and so on. But there you could see very clearly who was worth what, who was a coward, who was a brave man, who behaved correctly, well, who despised his comrades. That meant something, not to mention the fact that aristocrats and commoners, university professors, their students and workers, peasants, were in the trenches. There was such a mix of people from different social strata that was hard to imagine before. It was completely life-changing, because people spent a few years with people who could think differently, live differently, with different ideas, and they themselves changed. The position of women changed completely. It is clear that before the war in all warring countries, it was assumed that a woman's task was to marry, bear children, and take care of the household. It could be a society girl who would find some worthy groom, or it could be a very simple girl from the city or the countryside. Clearly they would have different wedding dresses, different standards of living, different houses, and so on, but the principles themselves were roughly the same. The war started. First of all, a lot of women and young girls start to participate in the work of the rear. First of all, they go to nursing courses, they start to work in hospitals. And this is a completely unexpected thing, if only because they communicate with a huge number of unfamiliar men, many of whom have to be changed, washed. It's a completely different relationship. And besides, at that moment, when a very large number of men were taken to the front, it turned out that someone had to support the family, and many women went to work. Meanwhile, of course, in the 19th, early 20th century, from a certain, not to high property level, married women did not work. A poor girl could go to work as a maid, governess, but if she got married, of course, she didn't work anymore. She worked at home. And now a lot of women go to factories, they go to work in some offices, again in hospitals. So their world is completely changing. This, by the way, will lead to how quickly after the war they will start to fulfill those demands that were harshly rejected in most countries before the war. If women can work, why can't they vote? But that is another matter. But at any rate, women are certainly becoming more independent. The world has changed. Everything has changed. Some people were left lying on the battlefield. Some came back maimed, concussed. Some people spent the whole war in the rear. It doesn't matter. The world has changed completely. People's reaction to the changes in the world. What happened in the first post-war years? Now we must somehow adapt to this new world, somehow live in it. What are the options? Maybe resentment, bitterness, irritation at the whole world. You can see it well in all countries. For someone, it is just his personal problems, his personal irritation, his personal post-traumatic syndrome. This is one option. For some, it's rage at the government, at the countries that defeated, say, Germany, and took away its land and stripped it of its army, or at those who didn't give Italy the pieces it had hoped for after the victory. In any case, this irritation pushes someone to revolution. Someone pushes someone to nationalist movements, to fascism. And this will also be a consequence of the war, of course. Some people are trying to cope with their problems, with the consequences of contusion, with shock, with trauma. Some of them will go to a psychiatric hospital. Others will be able to spill their problems on canvases, on paper, where poems will be written down. And it is not by chance, of course, that art will become much darker after the war. But there is another aspiration inherent in a huge number of people. The war is over. Let us rest, rejoice, have fun, enjoy life. We have survived. Everything is fine, so we should have fun. Naturally, not everyone can afford it. After the war, Europe lies in ruins. Not only did the war take so many lives, but there was a Spanish epidemic. Millions died. The war ends. The war industry is winding down in all countries. Accordingly, unemployment rises. Poverty, hunger, epidemics, well, in general, everything is very grim. for a huge number of girls in England, in France, in all the countries that have been at war. There is no more chance to marry because a whole generation has been knocked out. Their husbands, their fiancés are left on the battlefield. And just finding a groom now becomes much more difficult. Many of them will be condemned to be single or to have some kind of loose relationship, because marriage also turns out to be something that will be under great question and doubt. Like all traditional institutions, but still, despite the moral problems, despite the financial problems, despite the wave of revolutions, speeches, strikes, people want to live. A few years passed after the end of the war, and life began to get better. The revolutionary unrest was booming, and everything seems to have calmed down. In the early 1920s in Europe, in America, everything's quiet. The economy starts to pick up. Not only that, but naturally, after such a recession, the economy starts to rise. And the mid-1920s is, in most developed countries, a big economic upswing, which means unemployment goes down, which means wages go up, which means you can earn more and spend more. Life becomes more nourishing, more affluent, more comfortable, generally more enjoyable. The world of cinematography in the 1920s. The splendor of movie theaters. A huge influence on the lifestyle began to be exerted by the cinema. The public tended to copy the clothes and mannerisms of their screen idols. Another thing, of course, very much defining the 1920s is the cinema, which is becoming more and more important. We understand that cinema also existed in the pre-war years, but the scale, the number of films, and their variety were fundamentally different. Yes, people had gone to the movies before. In the 1920s, virtually all developed countries are covered with a network of cinemas. Naturally, most of them in large cities, some where they are smaller, the more rural areas, the fewer cinemas, but it still becomes a sign of the times. By the way, in rural areas you can now take a car and go, say, to a neighboring town to watch a movie. At first, cinemas prefer to build such luxurious. Here in America they built movie theaters palaces. There were carpets, columns, marble. That is, a person came, and he really got into another world. Today, of course, there are cinemas for all tastes. Well, in general, some shopping center. There is a cinema hall. Bought a ticket, went in. Of course, you are still transported to another world, because the lights are off. Something is on the screen. But when a person came, really got into the palace, it was very keenly felt. Because life in general, of course, it became easier and richer. Well, in general, was not very rich, and suddenly you find yourself in some fairy tale kingdom, and there you are shown amazing stories. And these stories, of course, were very diverse. And there were all the current genres. There were comedies, there were westerns, there were horror movies, there were movies for children. Well, here's all developing and emerging at that moment. Historical movies, war movies for God's sake. But at the same time, as one film historian remarked remarkably, cinema in the 1920s showed a society where almost everyone, unless it was a cowboy or a comedy character, was dressed in evening dress, lived in an elegant house, and spent his free time in the cabaret. Young heroines prostitushki, society ladies, heroes handsome, detectives, criminals. It all happens in a special elegant world. And it is very characteristic that this world also set the level of consumption, because you wanted to be like the heroine, and to this were added magazines, which described how the stars who played these heroines and heroes lived. And so this stimulus to consumption, on the one hand, came from the screen, on the other hand, came from magazines. This is also something that before the war was practically non-existent. It is clear, of course, that a simple housewife cannot dress like a movie heroine or a movie star, but she can aspire to it. And when by the end of the 1920s sound films began to spread, here, of course, the movie became a whole world, luring people. It's a very symbolic thing that one of the first of these big sound movies that was released by Warner Brothers Studios was called The Jazz Singer. It's a coincidence, of course, but it's just clear that if you're going to make a sound movie, there has to be music. It has to be something new. it has to be modern. What could be better than to make a movie about a man who wants to sing jazz? Cinema, of course, as until today, shapes a lot of things in our perceptions. The influence of movies on people's lives. It was a big innovation then. But you have to understand this thing. Naturally, people watched movies and thought, I want such a house, I want such a dress, I want such a car, I want such a life. On the other hand, cinema formed a certain idea, not only about the material framework of life, but also about life itself. For example, there is a huge number of different memories, stories, records of young people of the 1920s who said that it was thanks to the movie that they realized how to court, how to approach a girl, how to kiss her for the first time, how to hug her, because in life they did not see it. The mores were completely different. On the streets, so no one really kissed. And in the movie suddenly you are told where to invite a girl, how to treat her, and girls also understand how to behave. It educates them to a certain extent. Well, then they'd say, on the contrary, it deprives them of education. But it's only a plus sign on the minus. Another thing, a certain type of person is created in principle. If we are not talking about a fairy tale or some historical film, but a modern story, a young, self-confident, independent girl who is not necessarily dependent on a man will act there. She may be married, she may be single, but she decides her own fate. For the 1920s, such a heroine was very unexpected. The older generation, by the way, often complained that, what is this even being shown? Some incomprehensible girls. The emancipation of women went in the 6th century. In the early XX, the war helped a lot. But here we were talking about more serious things, the right to vote, the right to work. And the movies simply created an image of an independent, self-confident, energetic young woman, a completely new ideal. If you imagine novels of the 6th century, even paintings, plays, the ideal will be different. Most of them will be modest girls who win their happiness by their modesty, their nobility, their virtues. Well, some Jane Eyre who suffered so much, who was so true to her principles, and everything ended well for her. In 1920s movies, it's a different kind of girl. It's not that they're terribly depraved, they're just different. They act differently. New women, new relationships demanded different outward appearances. The production of cosmetics has become a large-scale industry. Even at the height of the Great Depression in 1930, its value was estimated at $180 million. And this in 1930 money. The number of beauty salons in the United States in the 10 years after 1920 increased eightfold to 40,000. Women wanted to be beautiful, fashionable, respectable, and active in all aspects of life. The licentious life of youth. The popularity of smoking. The image of a smoking girl. For a large part of the urban population, and let's not say for everyone, life in the 1920s is a life full of youthful entertainment. A life much more out of the house than before. It is a life that gives so many opportunities to have fun, to travel, to drive, to woo girls or accept advances, to go dancing to some new such nervous music. Fitzgerald wrote, by 1926, everyone was obsessed with sex. Why by 1926? I don't know. A life filled with some kind of erotic relationships that maybe don't even necessarily lead to sexual relationships, though certainly much more than for previous generations. A life with the magical world of movies, nightclubs, music, alcohol, both in America, where it is still associated with breaking the law, and in other places, where, of course, everywhere there is an age up to which you can't drink, and everyone still breaks it. Smoking is very widespread. This, by the way, is promoted by advertising, because before the war different people smoked. But in general, it was assumed that men smoked. And post-war advertising made great efforts to create an image of an elegant, fashionable woman with a cigarette in her hands. There were some wonderful ideas. First of all, there was an argument that if you smoke, you will have a hoarse voice, not melodic enough to impress young people. They specifically asked, say, opera singers to advertise smoking, saying, well, it's clear. I smoke and sing opera arias and nothing. And the other thing, which is absolutely wonderful, of course, is that they explained that smoking is a way to lose weight. And no more diets. If you smoke, you will be as slim as the girl in this picture. It becomes part of the image of the modern independent girl. The ideal of a girl of the 1920s: hair, clothes, makeup, lifestyle. Another, of course, very important component of this image is, in general, her lightness, her thinness. The 6th century knew different periods, different images of female beauty. But in general, women with large forms were valued. Not only that, if you imagine the dresses of the 6th century, they also changed from decade to decade. But these dresses emphasized a large bust, which was always, of course, a dignity, emphasized, let's say, the stern, which sometimes even increased due to some decorations on the back of the dress, plume and various such sewing frills. The ideal of the 1920s, which shows fashion magazines, movies, the life of secular society, is a tall, thin, very light girl. What was called a flapper suggests that when they dance, they flap their arms like this, flap like birds. And she's all light, like a bird. And everything that could weigh down the image has been removed. Her hair is cut, which, of course, was considered totally obscene in previous generations. No, the hair is cut. It's styled cleverly. By the way, men also styled curly, short curls with the help of gels. Further, light dress, well, corsets, of course, are a thing of the past. The bra gives much more freedom of movement, and at the same time does not emphasize the breasts so much. Just as this straight dress hides the hips, it hides the buttocks. As one historian very accurately noted, everything that is in some way connected with reproductive function is hidden. A young woman is no longer a creature designed primarily to marry and bear many children, but a cheerful, joyful creature, light, fluttering like a bird, dancing the Charleston or some other dances with strange movements. Relations between the sexes were greatly influenced not only by the birth of youth culture, the weakening of parental control over the younger generation, but also by the widespread dissemination of Sigmund Freud's ideas about the connection between repressed sexuality and the development of neuroses. From this same root, the fashion industry, which boomed in the 1920s, was also fed. In 1921, the first Miss America pageant was held. And how do flappers behave? Of course they smoke. Of course they are very sassy. Of course they don't listen to their elders. They break one heart after another and have fun. They use cosmetics, these modern girls. In the 19th century, it was clear that if a woman was blushing, she was doing something indecent. But now a rich heiress, a student or a department store clerk has a certain amount of makeup on her face, paint her lips, tint her eyelashes, it was normal. Another thing, they are emphasized sporty, because cars, because they bow down to pilots. But someone lucky, maybe can also fly. But anyway, it's an ideal. Swimming, bathing, swimsuits, by the way, have also become much lighter and much more open. They have such an active lifestyle, tennis. It changes their lives completely. At the same time, of course, again, advertising has explained to them that a person cannot emanate bad odor, especially from a girl. Armpits, mouth, everything must be very clean, everything must be fragrant. And they have opportunities for this: deodorants, pads, mouthwash, toothpaste, or tooth powder. There's more and more of it, and more and more. And that's why corporeality doesn't go away, because there is always some flirting, but in any case, it is not aimed immediately. This corporeal life is not aimed at family life, at continuation of the family, at motherhood. It is aimed at pleasure, at amusement. By the way, as far as family life is concerned, there are certain changes there too. Of course, the woman is mainly engaged in housekeeping, but she has a great relief thanks to the different appliances we have already talked about. But it varies from country to country. But the general tendency, first of all, of course, in Protestant countries, is to facilitate divorces. And the number of divorces is immediately increasing. And this also changes the whole view of the family and the whole view of life, their life. Dry law, the symbol of the Roaring Twenties, was the dry law adopted in 1920. It is interesting that the dry law adopted in Tsarist Russia during World War I contributed to the fulfillment of the long-standing dream of American fighters for sobriety. American progressives decided not to lag behind and to act even more decisively as a result. For the only time in the history of the United States, one amendment to the Constitution, the 18th, introducing a ban on the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol. This law had to be repealed in 1933 with another, the 21st Amendment. But those years passed under the sign of the drinking law. If we are talking about America, then, as a kind of symbol of the Roaring Twenties, one of the factors that gave a special spice to entertainment, of course, was the dry law, adopted in 1920. Interestingly, the dry law adopted in Tsarist Russia during World War I contributed to the fulfillment of the long-standing dream of American fighters for sobriety. American progressives decided not to lag behind and to act even more decisively as a result. For the only time in the history of the United States, one amendment to the Constitution, the 18th, introducing a ban on the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol, prohibition, which was enacted in 1920, prohibited the production and sale of alcoholic beverages, but, characteristically, not the purchase, so buyers were not risking anything. If we watch some movies where the action takes place in America in the 1920s, it seems that everyone broke the prohibition. Or if you read Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, everyone drinks, of course, but in fact, the picture of the big city is just those who formed this image of the roaring 1920s. Statistical studies, of course, there is a difficulty here. Not everyone admitted that they drink or would like to drink, but in general, it is clear that, for example, in the South drank little, that in general in rural areas drank much less than in the cities. The bigger the city, the more violations of prohibition there are. If only because it's easier to hide at dawn in a small town. Everyone is out in the open. Everyone sees each other. Everyone speaks their mind. In a big city, it's easy to get lost, and there are underground bars, restaurants, a whole structure of alcohol production or delivery from Canada and trade in it. There are doctors who write a prescription that makes it clear that the patient can't do without alcohol, and many different other tricks. Of course, the higher we go up the social ladder, the more of these violations occur. It's not the working people who drink, it's the middle class, it's the upper classes. You can afford it, it gives you so much pleasure. Although, of course, in the city to some extent everyone, or many of them, were violating the law because there were a lot of migrants in the cities, especially in the north. The idea of prohibition was completely puritanical, out of the traditions of the American past. Italians, Irish, Poles, who came from Europe. They did not understand these religious and moral justifications for prohibition. And secondly, there were traditions of wine for Italians, whiskey for the Irish, beer for the Germans. Why should they give that up? It was absolutely incomprehensible to them. There was a lot of talk about how these newcomers were getting the American people drunk. But the American people themselves were ready to drink when it came to New York or Chicago. Of course, all the unrestrained fun of the 1920s could not do without alcohol. Just its production and distribution were engaged in various shady structures. So in the United States rose the famous mafia. And the main Chicago mobster, Al Capone, became one of the most colorful characters of this unique era. Al Capone, the famous gangster, whose empire, in fact, blossomed during Prohibition, primarily on the liquor trade, although there was far from only that. Al Capone openly stated the following: "I am a public benefactor. Thirst cannot be cured by law. Some call it illegal liquor, some call it racketeering. I call it business. They say I'm breaking the dry law, and who doesn't?" First chain stores' technological innovations in American life in the 1920s were far from being limited to automobiles, radio, sound movies, or household appliances. During this period, many important changes occurred in many different areas of daily life, in the organization of trade and food production. And almost always at the heart of these changes were some new technologies, scientific discoveries, new lifestyles. Even during the First World War in the United States, appeared the first chain of self-service stores, Piggly Wiggly. Its founder Clarence Saunders patented all the key features of the new model of trade organization, such as entrance through turnstiles, price tags on goods, baskets for customers, counters with cash registers. By the beginning of the Great Depression, there were thousands of such stores in the country. Since the 1920s, the American fast food empire has its history. In 1921, the first of the White Castle chain of fast food restaurants was opened. Customers were offered burgers for 5 cents and a few other unpretentious dishes. The idea of fast food quickly gained millions of fans, especially against the backdrop of the decline of traditional restaurants under Prohibition. Americans were eating at home less and less often, and if they did cook, it was with the new and varied products offered by the booming food industry. In 1929, through the efforts of Clarence Birdsey, the technology of deep freezing of food products became widespread, and even earlier, the technology of adding vitamins and minerals to food. Great American writers probably no decade in American history has known so many new technologies, new opportunities for investment, and new trends in culture and the arts. In the decade following the end of World War I, American society changed beyond recognition, at least the urban part of it. According to the 1920 census, for the first time in history, the urban population of the United States was higher than the rural population. American cities were transformed not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively. Automobiles were rapidly displacing from the streets of carts. Central districts were being actively built up with skyscrapers. Constantly cheaper electricity lit up the streets brighter and brighter, turning night into day, changing the daily rhythms of work and rest. Rising family incomes allowed more and more young people to devote time to study and entertainment, to collective pastimes. Youth turned into a serious social force, began to actively fight for a place under the sun, to rebel against the archaic social foundations. None of the politicians of the past, neither the labor movement, nor the farm movement, nor the populists or progressives could do what American youth did in the 1920s. They created a new mass culture. Of course, it was not only young people who were into jazz, film, dance, and the new professional sports. Nor were they the only ones writing and reading books and inventing new styles of dress. But it was to the generation of 20 and 30-year-old American urbanites of the 1920s that we owe the emergence of most of the new cultural phenomena that then spread around the world. We hope you found our immersion into the era of the 1920s and 30s fascinating and informative. However, these decades are so packed with events and phenomena that it is impossible to cover everything in one video. If we miss something important or you have your own thoughts and memories of this time, feel free to write to us in the comments. Your feedback and ideas will help us make our videos even better and more interesting. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos about important historical events. Give us a like if you like this video and share it with your friends so they can learn more about the fascinating history of the 1920s and 30s. Thank you for watching. See you soon on our channel.